by respected sports scientist Ross Tucker. Ross, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it. The IAAF releasing this media statement a short while ago. What do you make of it?
I think it's the inevitable outcome. We've been anticipating this since about November last year when they first hinted at it. The brief history of it is that in 2015, when their previous policy was set aside, they were given a mandate from the Court of Arbitration for Sport to go away over the next 2 years and try to find evidence to support the policy. And this announcement today is basically their conclusion of that process, saying, here's our evidence and here's our new policy. I think it's weaker than the first position. I think the policy that had previously been set aside by CAS was actually better than this one. I think that there are a number of very questionable decisions and aspects to this policy, and I would imagine that if this policy were challenged, it would have a great difficulty surviving that challenge.
I mean, it looks like it's targeted at Caster Semenya because her races are that between 400 and 1500 meters. And that's why she even retweeted posts with this argument, because she believes it as well.
Yes, and I understand why that perception exists. And there are elements of it that I think are true. I think that when the IAAF added the 1500, they began to skate on some quite thin ice. And unless they've got strong evidence for that, that in particular is questionable. The 400-800 combination, I understand, because what they did, remember in response to the court who said, bring us evidence, is they did a study in 2011 and 13 where they looked at the performance levels of all the female athletes at the World Championships, and then they divided them into high testosterone and low testosterone, and they compared them. And their own evidence showed that the 400 hurdles, and 800 were significantly improved by high testosterone. So those events I understand, because given that CAS wanted evidence, the IAAF will say, well, here's your evidence. The addition of the 1500, I don't understand, because their own evidence shows that that event wasn't affected by testosterone. So they seem to have added that in somewhat arbitrarily, and that's why the accusation exists. I don't, for the record, believe that they are specifically targeting Semenya, but I think that there are questions that need to be asked about how they arrived at that addition of the 1500.
So you are saying that studies have shown that if you have higher testosterone levels, you will have an advantage in a 400 and 800 meter.
Yeah, so the study was 400 hurdles, 800, and then they also found it in hammer throw and pole vault. So there were 5 events in which high testosterone improved performance compared to low. Now, we don't need to worry about going into the detail, but that evidence is actually quite weak. The advantage they find is between 2 and 4%. Which is nothing like the advantage men have compared to women, which is about 10 to 12. But yes, the short answer is that's where their evidence, weak as it is, finds a difference. And so that's why those events are included. But then they've added the 1500 for reasons that I don't fully understand.
So what sort of medication would female athletes with high testosterone levels now be forced to take, and what are the side effects?
So that's a question that you might actually direct more to an endocrinologist. But what we do know is that they take a drug that then suppresses the release of testosterone in the body. And so it brings the level, and they've got to hit a target of 5. The problem with that is that testosterone is obviously quite an important hormone in the body. It has a number of different functions. It's not just for the purposes of sport. And so when you have someone whose testosterone has always been up here, and you then lower it to 5, that person becomes, in theory, at risk of certain health complications. They basically become almost menopausal because they're in the same state as someone in their late 50s who no longer has estrogen or testosterone, and they are, as a consequence, sometimes quite negatively affected. And that's part of the reason why, if you're going to have this policy, you have to be very sure that it's necessary, because you're not doing something benign to the health of athletes when you force them to take these drugs.
So, I mean, looking at it from a South African supportive, patriotic perspective, you have many people in the industry, many South Africans saying this is not fair. In your professional opinion, is it?
I think, and this is a long, obviously, argument, long philosophical, I think that the principle of having male and female sport is important because there's biological difference. And I think that if you have categories, then you need to have some way to distinguish them. So in principle, I think there needs to be a way to identify. In this specific case, I don't think that this policy does that fairly. And so I think this policy is weak, and I think that if it is challenged, whether that's by Semenya or someone else, this policy will be kicked aside by CAS as well, and Caster Semenya will be able to continue running. So I think that the solution still needs to be found, and that this policy is not that solution because it isn't strong enough, it lacks evidence, and it looks too arbitrary.
All right, thank you so much for your time and your insight. We appreciate it. Sports scientist Ross Tucker.